Well, hello, everyone. My name's Chris Giles. I'm an economics commentator at the Financial Times, and I want to welcome you all here to NISA for a discussion on the costs of security. Now, I'm going to be naughty as chair. I'm going to change the title as we speak to the costs and benefits of security, because I think we want to be economists here, at least in some part, and think about both costs and benefits. We just had the Chancellor yesterday talk about the benefits of securonomics, her phrase, not mine. And we know from what's going on in Iran about the importance of economic security, and from the past few years of the importance of national security. Anyway, that's all I'm going to say as an introduction. I'd really like to introduce my panel. So on my far right, as you look at it, is Jenny Bates. She's the Hayward Fellow this year at the Blavatnik School of Government, also a Foreign Office official. Today, she will be speaking in a personal capacity and not for the government. To her left is Trevor Taylor, who's the Director of Defence, Industries and Society Programme at RUSI, the Royal United Societies Institute. And to his left is Jens Larsen, who is the Head of Geoeconomics at the Eurasia Group. What we're going to do today is they're going to give 5 minutes or so as an introduction, then we'll have a little discussion on the panel, and then we'll open it up. And so most of the time will be for your questions, not for my questions or for their opening remarks. So really think of some good questions and let's have a really sort of communal discussion about this very important topic. Jens, do you want to kick us off?
I can. Now that I have turned on the microphone, Chris asked me to do if you want global context to the conversation. That's pretty much what I do for a living. It's tempting to start off with the crisis in the Middle East, but I won't do that. But do a sort of step back and try and discuss and set out a framework for thinking about what it is that's shaping our environment from the global perspective. And then I'll hand over to Jenny, who will speak more about the UK context. So for me, the central point is that the character of the United States has changed. The United States is now the principal source of geopolitical risk and uncertainty, no longer the anchor for the economic and security system. It's more unpredictable, less reliable as a partner, increasingly willing to unwind elements of the global order that it has established itself. At Eurasia Group, we talk about the G0 world. It's not that the US isn't dominant militarily, they are, but they have rescinded leadership in many dimensions when it comes to foreign policy, when it comes to economic policy, and so on. Much of that is structural, it's not Trump specific. I'm going to make that point repeatedly, and I think that's important for the conversation here. These are structural factors. Donald Trump is clearly testing boundaries and norms. I was thinking about today, he's also testing my patience, acting in ways that appear volatile. But we should think of him and his lot as a pretty organized bunch that have a project to reshape America, but also to reshape America's role in the world. His focus remains domestic. So I'm not going to spend an evening talking US domestic policy, but for understanding US foreign policy and therefore the global security environment, his agenda, domestic agenda, is important. It is anchored. He is anchored in a MAGA global worldview. It's about restoring the United States' internal national order, addressing perceived injustices. That runs much deeper than Trump himself. It runs to his cabinet, to the key advisors, and to the MAGA movement. Control of that MAGA movement is essential for Trump. And when we're interpreting what's going on currently and more broadly, that's really critical. The pressures domestically are growing. Strong pushback from the courts. We can talk about IEPA ruling, although they are tariff and trade related. I think that's got an important security dimension. The MAGA coalition is showing signs of strain, including under the pressure from the Middle East. But most importantly, and I think this is critical, the economy is not delivering for the lower middle classes. So affordability is a key political vulnerability for Trump ahead of the midterm elections, where we think the Democrats are going to flip at least the House. Again, why do you care about the midterm elections in a national security environment? Because it does help define Trump's foreign policy agenda, but also restrain his actions in that space. In that space, in the foreign policy space, Trump has been emboldened by success in Venezuela and the success earlier in Iran round one, if you want. The result being a more unilateral US, not just in its own sphere, but beyond that. The Greenland crisis illustrated that the change in relationship wasn't just towards the US adversaries, but also to allies, partly driven by Trump's desire to put his personal stamp on the map and expand US territory, but also by genuine strategic concerns about US security and about excluding China China and Russia in the Arctic. So there's an element of the personal, but there's also a structural and important security element. The response, I think, is illustrative and important. So the Europeans stepped up when Trump threatened on trade. The Europeans came up with a credible, I think, and coherent response and escalation on trade, but also importantly, again, relevant to our conversation, a security strategy that would strengthen the European and the NATO security presence in the Arctic. So combined with, I think, the unpopularity of the whole Greenland saga in the domestic space, I think it tells you that if you can mount a credible resistance and if you have a credible plan, then you have much more leverage, which is absolutely critical in dealing with Donald and with the US. There's a bigger lesson, I think, and I certainly experienced that in talking to my fellow Danes. The breakdown in the relationship between the US and its allies, it's a fundamentally transformed relationship with an erosion of trust, not just in Greenland, but also critically in the Russia-Ukraine crisis. Until such time, Europe builds a capacity to support Ukraine or a Ukraine in a future situation on its own, it'll remain structurally dependent on the US. And that, I think, is the strongest incentive to build strategic autonomy. It's no longer abstract, absolutely urgent. So with that, 2 or 3 words on 3 points on the Middle East crisis. We can sure talk about that in more detail, but I think 3 points. The first being the war has demonstrated again the capacity for US actions to generate enormous market and commodity market and financial market volatility and profound uncertainty. Second, unlike the Greenland case, the path from here to de-escalation is not as obvious. In Greenland's case, it was a matter of a speech saying, "Oh, I didn't mean that." That's not so easy with Iran. The third point I would make is that it illustrates yet again that the natural outlet, if you want, for geopolitical tensions are these large supply shocks that tend to be sustained. So negative supply shocks is a feature of this landscape. We've now seen it every year and a half. You, Chris, have talked eloquently and precisely about the reoccurrence of these events, and it shapes policy and politics. U.S. domestic policy is U.S. domestic economic policy is also being reshaped. Lots of intervention in the domestic economy, but of course also interventions in the global sphere. We can talk about the IEEPA tariffs, as I said. The key thing for me in this context is one where the U.S. has embraced industrial policies. This administration has. The previous administration had a different shape of industrial policies. But industrial policy, I think, is now well established. An interventionist approach to economic policy is well established. That means, I think, again, in the security context, that you have to take into account that other actors are acting in a way that's very different from the way we used to conduct economic policy. It's no longer about fiscal stability, monetary stability, and a bit of competition. It's about a much broader, more strategic framework where you're using economic policy tools for other purposes. So is it all about the Donald? Of course it isn't. It's also about China state capitalism, about the strategic tensions between China and the US, how Europe and we are gonna position ourselves in that context. It is also about Russia and an aggressive Russia and how we respond to that. But I think in terms of the big change over the last 12 months, I think it is this breakdown in the trust between the US and Europe that is redefining our security environment. Let me stop there.
Thanks very much, Jens. I'm going to ask you one very quick question before we go to Jenny. In terms of the global economy, we've seen last year, at this time last year, just in April, we had Liberation Day tariffs, and we thought that was going to really be a really very bad supply shock for the global economy. And yet it turned out essentially to be okay. So after April, forecasts were persistently revised higher globally. Is Iran different?
Before the weekend before the Iran shock, I had circulated an updated forecast note or global outlook note that said it was all going to get better, for more or less that reason. As in macro policy uncertainty was receding, Trump is less able to use the tariff instrument. I think the principal source that turned out to be a paper tiger last year was this uncertainty that we typically assign a big weight turned out to have very little impact. He's less capable of creating uncertainty. The tariff instrument is there, the tariff war is there, but the capacity to use that as a leverage tool is much reduced. So that was my point before Iran. Iran and prolonged very high commodity prices, I think, is a more real shock. It's a more traditional channel. I do think there's a fair chance that, and that is our base case, that in 3 or 4 weeks, we will see the impact of this shock fade. And my base case is still that growth will be okay and the impact overall will be limited. But we have an unusually fat tail on an outcome where the war lasts for longer. Iran digs in, the US can't find a de-escalation path, and where the shock, not just to oil prices, but to gas, to other commodities, lasts for longer. And that is, it is the most classic example, if you want, of a negative supply shock.
Yes, it really does show the sort of the paradox at the moment that the global economy is at the same level, quite resilient and yet terribly vulnerable to geopolitical events. Jenny, help us think about this more from the UK perspective.
Thanks very much, Chris, and it's really great to be here. And just to confirm that I'm speaking in my own name as I talk about these issues. So Jens has done a really good job of setting this up, because my first point was going to be that we are experiencing a systemic shift. And I basically agree with everything that Jens has said about the position of the US in this system, the rise of China disrupting it, the benefits of globalization and the impact on domestic communities, and not just in the US, I think in other parts of the world. And I would add to that also the fact that an issue that we talk less about, but is still there, the need to undertake the necessary transition for the adjustment to living on a sustainable planet. All of those things mean that we are moving into a different phase of global order or disorder, and we need to think about that from a UK perspective. So I fundamentally agree with that assessment. I think when thinking about the UK, and this is what I'm trying to do in my fellowship this year, it's been quite interesting that there's not very much written actually about middle-sized countries. Lots of people are writing about the US and China and the EU, but actually what the rest of us should do has had less discussion. I think it's worth grounding that, first of all, in what kind of country we are. And I'm not going to give a long list, but just to sort of remember. So the UK, I think, is very clearly a medium-sized, middle-sized power. Economically, we're 3% of global GDP. The other large economic powers are closer to 18 to 20%, whether that's the US, China, or the EU. And if you do long-run kind of scenario trend type analysis, you see the rise of India perhaps happening into an interesting place. But those big blocks largely remaining big chunks of the global economy, because once you become large, it's very hard not to continue being a large part of the economy. The UK is always going to be middle size. We're a defence power, which is relevant to today's discussion. I think also we're very open and reliant on global markets. So we've never been food self-sufficient. We rely on access to energy for our own energy security, and even on things like science and technology that we're very good at. We still only account for 3% of global patents. We do not have a monopoly on good ideas in the UK. So all of that suggests that autarky is not a good strategy for the UK. Interestingly, I think some of the bigger economic powers, it makes more sense for them. You can see why they have a more inward-looking national market strategy. I'm not saying it is necessarily completely right for them to do that, but when you have a larger domestic market, it makes you can see the thought process behind that. And of course, we're a services-based economy. We have high-end manufacturing, but often with services around it. We're very good leaders in science and innovation. One of the WTO's recent reviews of world trade pointed out that the UK alone accounts for 10% of digital trade, 10% as the UK. So we have these features of the UK that we need to bear in mind. I think the other point I wanted to make before I come to what we should do, particularly sitting here at NISA, is that I think in this changing world order, we need to use all of economics and not just some of it. And what I mean by that is the old frame of the earlier era of globalization was very focused on marginal efficiency, prices reflecting full value, comparative advantage, perfect markets, let's extend and deepen markets and drive efficiency. And maybe at some point, the economies were tending towards more similar models. And you can see why we thought that to some extent with the fall of the Berlin Wall and the integration of Eastern European economies into the European Union and progress in that direction. It felt like we were moving towards a more common kind of economic model. And I think what we're saying is we really aren't. And so we need to remember a couple of things. One is we need to do, I think, a much deeper assessment of risk and benefit. And this is why I think we're all reacting to the cost of security. Well, what cost, defined how, by whom, with what assumptions? We need to take account of costs that are not easily measurable. We need to have a longer term lens. And we do need to think about the issues that I think the Chancellor's raising on securonomics. So an obvious example of this would be, just to take one, stockpiling doesn't look like a very sensible strategy if you think markets are deep and efficient and price reflects the cost that you should be paying. If you think there's going to be a supply disruption to the market every 6 months for the next 10 years, stockpiling looks like a much more viable strategy and not a cost. So I think this assessment of kind of risks and benefits, we really need to get deeper into it. I agree with Jens that we need to be thinking much more about state capitalism, directed credit, monopoly, and unlevel playing fields. These are all things we learned in our economics when we were studying it, but we've sort of forgotten about some of it globally, I think. Clearly, that's partly the rise of China and its economic model not being as compatible with the global rule system that we developed. But I think also when you look at the defence sector, and I know we're going to come on and talk about that, defence spending and national security is one of the most intervened in markets. It's very closely linked to the state, quite understandably. It's where you get all the exceptions around national security and procurement, understandably. But it's not, I think, the case study of purely efficient markets in quite the same way. And lastly, I think we need to get back thinking much more about leverage and negotiations, game theory, those things that many of us also studied, power relations and not just mutually beneficial exchange. So that's what I mean by we need to kind of do all of economics, not just some of it, and bring those kind of frameworks to help us think about where we should go. So then what should a country like the UK be doing in this kind of security space? And I think there's kind of three, in my work, I've sort of said there's kind of three broad objectives that we need to be thinking about. And I'll give you an example for each of them that's linked to the security space. The first is clearly we need to think much more deeply about defence and resilience. And I don't just mean defence in the traditional sense of defence. I mean the broader sense of defending the economy and its resilience. We need to remember that openness is a source of strength, but it's also a source of risk. We've done some of this work following COVID and thinking about supply chains, but it's still quite narrowly focused in the UK. I think we need to think about it in a broader context. We have things like the National Resilience Action Plan. We have a list of chronic risks. We have done some work in government to think about the kinds of shocks and effects that could hit the economy. But I don't think we've done enough to think about how we would mitigate them and how we would invest to reduce dependencies where the risk is high. I think there's actually some quite interesting things we can learn from financial stability and financial markets in this, because it feels like whenever I talk to colleagues in that part of the world, they're more used to thinking of openness as a source of imported vulnerability as well as opportunity. So that's, I think, the first area where we need kind of ongoing strategic attention. The second area is on competitiveness. And this I always think of as the list I would have written 20 years ago when I was in the Treasury too. It hasn't really changed. We still need to grow. We need access to markets. We need investment. We need innovation. We need ideas. I think the interesting question here, to build on what Jens was saying, is how you do that as a middle-sized power, who you're cooperating with and what that looks like. And I think the interests of middle-sized powers are more convergent on some of these questions than the larger powers. So just to give one example in the defence space, I think you can think of the GCAP programme, which is the stealth fighter jet cooperative programme that we have with the UK, Italy and Japan. It's a very interesting example in my mind of a middle ground, middle power coalition coming together to build defence industrial capability and also build capacity. What's interesting about it, I think, is partly it reflects the fact that middle-sized powers recognise that they cannot do this on their own and that they need to partner to get the efficiency and the scale, but also that there's more sharing of technology and expertise in my understanding of this programme than you would typically get if you partner with a very large power in developing your defence sector. So I think there's more convergence of interest, as I say, between those three partners in what they're trying to do than simply a selling and buying relationship that you might have with other partners. And I think we're going to need to do more of that, including with other European powers. And then the third piece that I think we need to think more about, and I think this also builds on what Jens was saying, is this concept of sort of strategic autonomy. How do we have agency and impact in this more contested world? I think we're often quite good in the UK at writing lists of things that we're good at, but I don't think that's quite the same thing as thinking about strategic autonomy and indispensability. The Japanese, and I was just in Japan a couple of weeks ago, have this concept of strategic indispensability. And what they mean by that is two things. It's partly having some things that you are good at that are unique to your nation that others want and that are hard to replicate. And that gives you an attraction value and something, it's a bit akin to concepts of comparative advantage, but it's a bit more sustainable. But also thinking about when needed, you may need to leverage that in negotiations or in interactions with other states where power is being deployed. And again, I think we need to think more about that. My example, again, in the security space, where I think we're starting to think about this in the UK, is something called the National Security Strategic Investment Fund, which was set up a number of years ago. Some of you might be aware, linked to the British Business Bank, came very much from the defence and security space, looking at dual-use technologies. But what's interesting about it, I think, is it's trying to do not just the development of the technology, it's also trying to think about how it can be focused on things that help reduce costs for the state, for procurement. So it's ultimately developing technologies that will be of use to the state in future, and is thinking about retention. So the fund takes equity stakes in businesses, and that helps, I think about value retention in the UK. Again, I think this is the sort of model that we're going to need to do more of in the UK to build our own kind of indispensability into the future.
Thank you very much, Jenny. If I can put you on the spot very quickly, the Chancellor yesterday was one of her big 3 reforms she wanted to make was closer ties with Europe, in which she essentially made a plea that there were mutual gains to be made on both sides, and therefore it's in the interest of everyone to work together. But that's the same thing as the UK government has been saying for 10 years now, and the Europeans aren't that obviously persuaded by that sort of rhetoric. Is there anything in the security space that we really offer when you say, something that we have that they would like, apart from our nukes? Is there something that we really have which is an indispensable offer?
So I think there is, and I think what's interesting is that as Europe itself is changing and evolving, it's having to address some of these new frontiers that are new and challenging for the EU as well. I think in a couple of spaces. I think in the economic security space, there's a lot that Europe is interested in what the UK has done. Everything from our strategic understanding of the risks and the environment that we operate in, through to how to design interventions that are ensure that you still get some of the efficiency without losing some of the risks. They were really interested in, in the UK's kind of inward investment screening regime and how we'd done that, because there is a tendency in Europe to go for more solutions that might lose some of the benefit of the engagement. I think, though, that the most interesting area is clearly the sort of defence industrial side, and I'm sure we're going to talk about that a bit. I mean, I was just in Berlin this week. If you're sitting in Germany and you're thinking about the scale of investment, again, and I ask my European friends, do you see yourselves as mid-sized powers in this world? You get a range of answers in Europe. Some partners say they are. Some say that Europe itself is a mid-sized power. But certainly in the defence industrial space, I think there is real appetite for doing the kind of thing that we've been doing in GCAP. How do you get to scale by partnering? How do you get efficiency in doing that? How do you share capability with a trusted partner? I think all of those things apply in thinking about partnering with European friends, not just Italy on GCAP. To be honest, I think the really interesting question is whether we can get ourselves to a mode of cooperating with Europe that enables that to happen. But when you have these kinds of conversations with European partners, I think they can see the strategic interest in it.
Thank you. Trevor.
Well, I probably could talk for 20 minutes in response to the other people panel.
You'll get your chance in a second,
but I won't do that. I mean, I think I wanted to, I was asked to talk about defence, and the title is cost of security, and I immediately reacted to the wrong question. But the other question is, what is the cost of insecurity? Try that.
Thank you very much, Trevor. So if I'm going to ask you a question specifically on what you said. So we don't spend a huge amount on it, and it's essentially defence spending is beneficial for the reasons you laid out. If we were thinking about raising defence spending as a nation, which we clearly are, and we don't think we can borrow to do that, we think we have to raise taxes to do that, and you're a politician, what's your argument to the public for why this is something they should pay more for now?
Good question. To which I usually duck out and say, I understand something about military operations and security, but public opinion. But I think, first of all, my principal message, and I feel quite strongly about this, is we are not spending money to win wars. I mean, there's a lot of people sort of saying, it's going to be a war, we've got to spend more on defence. I think that's counter-effective of public opinion. What we should be telling people is that we need to spend more so that we don't have to spend more. So we don't have to fight wars. Yeah? During the Cold War, I think I might be the only person in the room that remembers it, but the military leaders of the country, when they were looking for money, they said, if there's a war, we fail. Because we are spending to deter the wartime acts. We are now going to be spending to deter other people that might be hostile towards us. So I think we need a greater emphasis on the deterrence being. The military obviously think, oh, if we're in a battle, how are we going to get on? But that's okay. You have to think about that, but you have to think about deterrence.
So it's essentially an insurance argument in that sense that we are paying more. Our premiums have gone up because the risks around the world are higher.
Well, it's slightly different. I mean, it is an insurance argument, but it's if you.
It's an insurance with the deterrence argument.
It's kind of related to it. If You are spending to reduce the risk terms. You are spending to reduce the likelihood of a war. Yeah. Whereas insurance usually doesn't
Change the absolutely. No, I understand. That's very well. No, that's very well put and a good point. I think the whole for all the panel. I think there's one thing that no one has mentioned so far. We've gone round it's not just about costs, it's the cost of insecurity. So there's a benefit to this spending. How much? How much do we need as a nation to spend? Trevor, do you want to give a go first?
Well, historically, we spent during the last 20 years of Cold War, we spent 5%.
Yeah.
And now whether that's enough, it depends on what the other side does. It might be able to get it much less. But in those sort of scales, thank you. In those scales, it doesn't matter. The big economic effect is not particularly negative. And I think it's, if I may, it's a kind of stupid question because, during the Second World War, we were spending more than 50% of GDP on defense. Okay? So that was a number that we were willing to pay. And we've got used to spending 2%. Now, the answer is dependent on the circumstances. The one thing that I would say, which links into this, is that if you want to go from 2% upwards, you shouldn't try to go too quickly, because when governments drastically increase their defense spending quickly, that really tends to increase money being spent for poor benefit. Yeah. So think of it as a steady increase that will not be thrown off course by a marginal change in political circumstances. But I mean, if we looked at Russia's defense spending now and said, well, we need to spend something that we alone need to spend something that matches Russia. But if you put Germany, France, and Britain together, the resource difference between that and Russia is enormous. Yeah. I mean, so if you said, well, we need to spend at least what Russia's spending, and either nationally or then that still would get you to it'd only get you to 4 or 5%.
Sure. Okay. So you're 4 or 5%, not too quickly, and there are some definitive beneficial effects of defence spending. Jens and Jenny, do you agree with that sort of schema? Because it's quite if you're a politician listening to this going into the next election, that's quite a lot of commitment.
And my deterrence point.
And the deterrence point is, I think, accepted that has a it has a beneficial effect, but the public need to be persuaded of that.
So it is a resource reallocation, and 2.5% over up to 2035, which is the current plan, is a significant amount of resources. And I think it's worth thinking about this not just as a bunch of fiscal numbers, but it's actually people, right? It's people who could otherwise be doing going to school, university, or looking after old people, or doing other great things that will have to spend time providing essential services. So 2.5% is a big number, totally economically feasible. But if you're combining it with the other requirements, the other demands that the Securenomics agenda requires, then you are looking at a substantial shift in resources away from current consumption towards defense and towards investment spending. So you are looking at resource allocation, and Dave's written a great piece. You might fund some of that upfront with additional debt, but at some point you have to level that up. And unless you believe they're great multipliers, I take your point that it's not as bad as it could be, but you have to really focus on the multiplier activities. You have to think there's some sort of
supply growth that comes
that
from
it creates something. But I think that the argument for that is strong, in part because we come off such a low base when it comes to investment in defense capabilities, that, we really could, if we and the Europeans decided to strengthen our internal capabilities, the returns to that in terms of additional investment in R&D, I think could be substantial. So I think that's got to be part of it, the element. Yes, absolutely, more people, more bases, stronger forces, more conventional forces and all that, but also a very, very directed effort to strengthening R&D spending.
Do you think then that defence spending, in some sense, can loosen resource constraints for the economy as a whole, or it is a reallocation within the existing set of constraints?
It might. So I think if you think it very quickly can loosen that constraint, if you think it's quickly productivity enhancing, I think all experiences, it's not that quick. But if you have a 10-year horizon, then I think you could have substantial benefits. But you would have to be very active and very aggressive, if you want, in the way you're thinking about that, the reallocation of resources. I think there's plenty of research supporting that. I think this idea that a substantial R&D element is beneficial, both in terms of developing capabilities, but also in terms of strengthening growth.
Yeah, I mean, I don't have a particular view on the right level of defence spending to GDP, but I suppose the logical conclusion of what I was saying is we need a slightly broader conception of what we think of as spending that increases our defence and resilience. So there's the sort of traditional military component of that, which is hugely important. But we're entering a world where we see much more use of economic coercion, the weaponization of economic levers, the fact that the countries can exert power and persuasion over other nations, not just through the deployment of military power, but particularly through the economic linkages. And so that means, this is why I think we need to think about resilience. I mean, other people have talked about this, but you're into your kind of communications networks, into the forms of exposure that you might have where you might need to build more resilience, which in some level will be seen as a cost because you're building in capacity to manage shocks or other effects. So I do think we need a slightly broader conception of the sorts of investments we're going to need to make as a nation. I'm afraid that probably means the figure needs to be a bit higher, but I think if we just think of it as purely the military side of things, we are misunderstanding the nature of the risks. They are, I'm afraid, a bit bigger than just that.
Okay, thank you very much. I think so. The panel is broadly agreed that more of the nation's resources need to go into the defence and wider security aspects to make us more resilient as a nation, and that will have definitive resource costs and maybe some benefits, but they might take some time to come. But the alternative might well be worse if we don't want to spend or allocate those things. This might be in a difficult electoral sell, but that is, I think, where the panel is saying Britain should go. I'm going to open it up to the room now. We've got just over half an hour, so we've got a lot of time for questions. Ron.
I think one of there are traditional obstacles. Everything happens very, very slowly. The obstacles to collaboration within Europe, French-German fighter aircraft really has to be a French one, and no problems. And I think the slowness is a real issue. If you go back to the Korean War, 1949, we were spending 6.3% of GDP. That went up to 11% of GDP in 53. We deployed 80,000 troops, more than we've got at the moment. So that speed can happen. And I agree with Trevor again, that doing it very rapidly, but one can imagine a scenario in which Ukraine completely collapsed, Russia came through, treated it like Venezuela, do it again, and you could imagine the speed at which those sorts of reactions and whether we'd be able to sort out all the procurement problems. Defence investment plan was promised last autumn. It's not clear when it'll ever appear. So those obstacles within the decision-making process, both within Europe and within the UK, I think are really major obstacles.
Do you have a question as well? I'm not having a go at you, Rob, but do you have a question for the panel?
They're reflections on the speed of adjustment.
So I think it's quite... I'm very much an economist, but I spend most of my time sitting with political scientists and people who are thinking security and those challenges. We think a lot about the pace of change and what pressure, what political pressure leads to in terms of action. And it's very striking how the changing winds from the US have led to more or less intensity on the European competitiveness agenda, but I think also in the debate in this country about how quickly to move. So when Trump was embracing Putin in February of last year, then there was suddenly a lot of momentum, and the Germans agreed to ease the constraints on defense spending and put in place a massive investment program. But as soon as that faded, the momentum faded with it. So I think the striking thing actually is that we have really had some massive shocks, not quite the shock you're describing, but really massive shocks. And the most substantial response in Europe is Germany by far, in terms of absolute size. Of course, the closer you get to Russia, the bigger you have seen the step up. I think you are already seeing a conversion in the Scandis. You've talked about the attitude in Copenhagen. Traditionally, not really that prone to talking about solidarity when it comes to fiscal policy. Now they want solidarity when it comes to defense spending. They really want the Italians and the Spaniards to step up, countering the Russian threat. The Italians and Spaniards not so interested. So I do think we are seeing the pressure. I do think we are seeing that movement. And I think over a 10-year period, it will happen. But because we are at such a low base in Germany, you have to reintroduce conscription. These, it is a resource reallocation that has a real impact.
And to what extent, when you talk to your political colleagues, to what extent do you see the reaction around the world being, oh, if only we wait 3 years and it won't be Trump anymore, things will be back to normal? Is that hope still in existence, or is that now dead?
I think that hope is on life support, but doing better when Trump turns a little on. So there's still a cyclicality to it, but I do think the Greenland affair, certainly in the minds of the Northern Europeans, was a very significant change. I mean, really, the notion of a U.S. military intervention against an ally was not something they had in their mind, and suddenly I think the expansion of the possible outcomes to include that means you have to rethink. So I think you are seeing that rethink in defense spending terms, in political terms, but you're also seeing it with lots of our investment clients and who are thinking about how to allocate their resources in a world that's much more geopolitically fraught.
I think we have to bear in mind the sort of the top of government and then the people that make all these things work in the machine. And there's no doubt that within the UK defense and intelligence system, a governmental system, there are a lot of personal links that people find it almost impossible to think they're going to have to give up. Yeah. So there's, I think there was one of the, I think the Economist found it, it might have been the FT, I can't remember, but found that somebody just retired from a Korean embassy. He said that we have a cultural problem. All our services want to do is buy American. And so the kind of head in the sand thing is there, which is probably stronger in the UK than it is elsewhere. But I mean, I think, it's not just, we shouldn't just think of the president of the United States. We have to think of the people that he's got around him, and the fact that he's been elected twice, and the whole position in the United States is worrying to me. If you said, what do we do about protecting Europe, I can tell you what to do. Spend a bit more money, and we do this and that and the other. And I would think we could deter Russia. It shouldn't be a challenge. What do we do about what's happening in the United States? I have no idea. Yeah.
I think that's a That's something that's afflicting all of us who've been used to the opposite for many years.
Yeah.
Jenny, how do you see the speed issue
Yeah.
and how quickly it's changing?
Yeah, I mean, just wanted to also comment on the kind of how's the rest of the world seeing this? I've done a bit of travel recently. I've been to Tokyo and Seoul and Berlin, Paris and Brussels, and I've tested the rupture thesis, and you get a very clear sense that people think there's a rupture. So I think Jens is right that events and behaviour has really shifted opinion. Whether that and how that translates into policy, I think, is the interesting question. But it's hard to find people that are arguing the opposite at the moment. In terms of the speed, I mean, that's got to be right. But I think I just come back to one of the truisms that somebody once said to me early in my career in government, and I always hold on to, is that the trouble with government is it's really hard to do big things quickly. The great thing about government is you can do a lot in the medium term. The state and policy making can deliver huge shifts if you have the right time frame in which to do it. And so, I mean, I think the only answer is we've got to do it at the pace that we can do it. We don't know that we're in the worst case scenario. We're in scenarios where we don't quite know where we're going. So we don't know for sure that we're in that. We might have quite a long period of uncertainty and heightened tension. We might have periods where it feels like it's reducing a bit. So I think the only thing the state can do is take a clear sense of direction and align resources behind it and move. But history would tell you that when we do that, we can move the dial a lot more than people sometimes think. I think that's the best answer to that question.
And you can see, certainly, as Trevor said, so the countries closer to Russia, Poland, for example, big European economy, has moved its defence spending up to 5% of GDP, mostly from borrowing, to be honest. So it hasn't really addressed the taxation side of things, but it certainly addressed the security side of things.
My point about going too quickly was actually rather a fiddly defence point, in the sense that buying a piece of equipment is just the start of the story. And if you haven't got the storage facilities, if you haven't got the logistics and arranged, if you haven't trained the people to use that equipment, blah, 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 if you haven't got the defence terms called defence lines, if you haven't done that, then you end up with equipment that you own it, but you can't really use it. So you need to make sure you've got enough time to put the rest of your machine around that equipment. So that was, I said, part of my point about if you go too quickly, you end up with stuff that you can't use.
Philip.
Thanks so much for all you've said. I just wanted, you talked a lot about defense technology. I just wanted to widen it into a conversation about technology or tech in general. And I'm thinking here partly of obviously AI, but also partly of just the tech platforms that we are all fundamentally used to, which are overwhelmingly American supplied, by the way. It seems to me that if you factor tech in, then the challenges facing medium-sized powers grow, both from an economic perspective and a security perspective. Economically, because there's obviously a strong link between the economies of scale and scope, which seem to drive market power in tech, and market size. So it's no wonder that they're American firms and closely being chased by Chinese. And from a security perspective, because we are all fundamentally dependent on American products. And if I could just add a little coda to that, I'd be interested in your reflections on that, how you might work tech into the thesis. Add a coda to that. I hear obviously there's a structural shift, but I think the language of rupture is too simplistic. It seems to me we're still in a phase of mutual dependence, but it's a deeply unstable and oscillating type of dependence. And probably one we're going to have to get used to, but also find ways of better managing. And if we're dependent on the Americans, by the way, ultimately they will call the shots. That's my controversial thesis.
Jenny, do you?
So I think this is a really important question. And just give a plug for the fact that in my scenarios that I've published, I've got one that's driven by technology, because I think we do need to think much more about what are the pathways that this evolution of technology could mean. And I've played around with the idea of even greater concentration of ownership of technology and what that means. And I think it does pose real concentration of economic power, the benefits of that being concentrated in particular groups, assuming that the mid-sized powers do not have any of their own scale of technology. When you look at that scenario, it's quite frightening, actually, for the UK. And I think it begs the question that you might want to be more activist about just not sleepwalking into it. So although it is a real challenge for a mid-sized power, I think it's a galvanizing sense that kind of future might not be the one that we want. So I think it takes you to a couple of different places. One of them is actually that the interests of mid-sized powers are different in this. We are, if you assume we're principally going to be consumers of technology, particularly around issues of data sovereignty. And if you get into AI at all, you understand that it's not just the model, it's the data. To be really good at this, you have to have the right data and you have to constantly apply it into the model. And it's our data, not those of the company. And what are we doing to put constraints, rules, norms around the use and deployment of that data? We have been quite open in how it has been deployed. And I think you are going to see mid-sized powers and others come forward with much stronger views about the conditions upon which they are happy to have their data used by some of these economic actors. So I think that that's one area. I think it does get you into some difficult questions about whether you need any kind of sovereign technology at all. And I think this is another question that is, again, sort of counter to the efficiency argument of just going for lowest price, cheapest delivery, but that kind of sovereignty and control. I think we're going to end up with lots more conversations about that, where and how. I think that's why it gets you into this leverage question. Where do you have something that gives you some agency to have skin in the game in a negotiation? That doesn't mean you need to do scale. The US companies are doing scale and global, and we can see the pathway that they're taking. But that doesn't mean everybody else has to do scale and global. You might have niche areas of this that you invest in intentionally that are part of your solution. So I completely agree with you that this is a frontier that we need to think more about. But I also think the more you look at it, or certainly the more I've looked at it, the more I've felt like you want to have an active policy response to that and not just kind of walk into an outcome. The last thing I would say is that, you know, that there's something, isn't there, about with technology, two other things. One, what are the use cases and what is it being deployed for? The owners of technology are the people that make those choices. And at the moment, it's a particular set of people making those decisions. But what we might want to deploy that technology for might be different. And I think we're going to get into all sorts of interesting conversations about that, which again takes you into the sense of who's sort of directing the use. And then I think there's something also in this kind of back to the kind of partnership model. So I was in Korea recently, and they were talking about one of their AI companies that is really giving Google a run for its money in Korea, doing it in a very specific Korean context. But its strategy being to not be the scale, but to have excellent data, a much more local strategy, better service delivery to the local market, and it is giving it a run for the money in that market. And so the sort of, do we need to always be following what the big guys are doing and thinking that that's the right strategy? For other players and for other needs, it may not be that scale and global is what we need. Something that is smaller, maybe not quite so frontier, but more suited to a market might be a better solution. And those might be the kinds of things that other partners are interested in developing together. So I think it's a big challenge, but I think it sort of almost demands more policy thinking rather than just assuming we're going to be a price taker in this world and kind of give up.
I think there are two bits. One is that when you look at the tech world and you go downwards into the supply base, it's much less US dominated. And of course, people are suddenly realizing that I'm full of admiration for the person that said, we're going to call data centers the cloud. Yeah? Was that fantastic? There is nothing less like a cloud than a data center. But I mean, you have the whole business of what's in the Netherlands. You know, in the key chip making machinery is in the Netherlands. We've got all the stuff that's going on about rare earths. So I think that's one thing that we have to remember, that others will have some leverage. You know, it might mean that Donald wants to take over Netherlands or buy that company and ship its machinery back to the US, but it's not quite as dominated as you think. And I think the other thing is that when you look at and this is a bigger question, but when you look at global R&D spending, when I was a boy, Ron, I looked to you, defense spending was about 35% of R&D spending around the world. It was a significant amount, and we looked and thought, how can you get defense spending into the civil economy? These days, I've had a look at the OECD numbers, and you see that defense is a very small proportion of it's about less than 10%. It's about 10% of, even in the US, it's quite low, things that are figured for defense. So defense is less, that's one of the lessons that come out. It's much less important. And so it's going to be borrowing more from that civil commercial world. But the other point is when you compare Europe and the US, the gap on R&D spending, there's still a gap, but it's much smaller than it is on defense spending.
Jens.
I just wanted to make the point on decoupling. We have actually got examples of countries that have decoupled or de-linked very rapidly. That's Russia. And managed in part because they had built a lot of redundancies. So the terminology, the engineering terminology of redundancies and robust control and independent systems, all that I think applies. And I think a lot of smaller, not mid-sized developed markets have looked at that experience and are thinking about what they can do to develop their own capacities to manage in those circumstances.
Great. We've got quite a few questions now. I'll just take guy in the red shirt. If you could introduce yourselves, that would be great.
Hi, Damien Mercier. Just straight follow on really from Jen's point there about redundancy and capacity. So our armed forces are like 3 people and a dog, and the dog's sick half the time. But one of the things that I wanted to mention, JIT, just in time, is sort of out the window a bit now for a host of other reasons on onshoring. But Turkey is the second largest military power in NATO. Their kit is fit for purpose. So given the scale of our armed forces, one of the things that I'd like to see, if it's any way at all to propose, is a sense of, given the size of our armed forces and the fact that even how small that they are, we still don't have sufficient kit for the size of the armed forces as is. How about, given the scale of Turkey's army, turnover of equipment, that there's a financial settlement across NATO whereby an element of redundancy is built in, and Western European forces, or significant portions of them, can be cross-trained on 2 platforms, British, French, German, whatever, and Turkish, and can be flown into region quickly as an active potential responsive force. That's an ideological point, it's an operational one, and it's a philosophical one, for sure. And of course, bottom line, it's a political one.
Thank you. Let's take another question. Go at the back.
Yes, I'm Nick Crittenden. I'm an associate economist here at NISA. Do we need to think about the structure of our defence industry? I think the MOD track record of procurement is pretty poor. I think maybe 7% of their projects currently underway are considered to be on time. And it doesn't seem to me that the way we're going to produce the kit we need to fight an armed conflict, but also have economic benefits such as dual use technology, I'm not sure that's going to come about by throwing £5 billion at BAE. Should we be looking at a smaller scale in terms of individual firms structuring our defence industry to be more innovative, or do we need to consolidate? Which way do we go?
Thank you. We'll put both of these to the panel. So that is Turkey, and I was in Turkey in December at their equivalent of the CBI, their business conference, and that would, your suggestion would be very popular in Turkey, I can tell you, because that was exactly what they were asking, whether there was any chance of taking a greater part, and then the track record of procurement being not a great one. Jens, do you want to take those two? And let's be quick, because we've got another quarter of an hour, and I see that other people want to ask questions.
It's my military experience lies a long way back in time, so I can't give you a proper assessment of what you're saying. But most of what you're saying is not technologically constrained. It's not actually that financially constrained either. So if that is a policy decision, that's perfectly feasible. And and part of it, and this is, I think, is what Carney said in that speech in Davos that everyone is quite rightly quoting, is, if you're diversifying away from the United States, it means contemplating other solutions. I don't know if that's Turkey. It certainly isn't China. I think it goes to the redundancies points too. It's basically you're reducing individual leverage and creating capacity elsewhere, and that has to be part of the creative thinking. I don't have strong views on how to organize the defense industry, but it seems to me very obvious that it has to be on scale, and that the most obvious alternative is to what we have is to strengthen the European involvement. I struggle to think of any other way of thinking of that.
Jenny, do you have as a middle powers? How does Turkey rank, and in terms of the track record of procurement being not great, just bunging BAE loads of extra monies, it might be seen as not the best way of spending taxpayers' hard-earned money.
Yeah, I mean, so yeah, Turkey's very much in the middle power space, right? And it's kind of where we've got convergence of interests and capabilities that we can work together with Turkey. It ought to be part of how we think about the future, definitely. So I think much of the thrust of what you were saying chimes with this. I mean, I'm not an expert on the defence industry, but it makes me think about, when you think about industries generally and government spending, which I used to do some of when I was in the business ministry, what you want is a vibrant sector that's innovating, has some elements of competition in it, and can deliver you what you need. And you need to think about how your instruments of buying and creating that market enable that to happen. My sense is, from a distance, that there probably are some innovations within the defence sector that would help us with that. Some of that's about the way that you do procurement. Some of it's about the kind of innovation and investment that goes on within businesses. I agree with Jens that when you're thinking about the kind of scale and the degree of shift that we're talking about, wanting to do that with partners and other players, particularly in Europe, has got to be part of the answer, because that kind of structural shift feels like it's just hard to do within one smaller economy. But this is one of those areas where the sort of more traditional economics around we want a vibrant, competitive, innovative sector that is delivering for the UK. That's got to be in our interest, and if we've not got that, we need to use the levers to develop it.
Trevor, is it unfair to have in our back of our mind that defence procurement is always chucking money down a bottomless pit?
I mean, I think many of the people that make this argument I wouldn't trust them to do the family shopping. So, I mean, if they think it's so easy, you do it. There you are. Take this responsibility. And I think you'd find a lot of people went very quiet at that point.
But what is it?
Well,
so you say, I mean, you can have a go at people who make the argument, but there has been, look at our armoured personnel carriers, for example, at the moment. There have been many examples of poor defence procurement, which we're all very unhappy about. How do we improve that?
Anybody, let's deal with, I mean, I think you have to think about particular cases. More generally, we have an acquisition system which is designed to get people to actually, let's say, be terribly optimistic or tell lies, because competitive procurement is about competitions of promises. Yeah, I promised to do this, I put it in a contract. So, of course, and if there's going to be one contract in 20 years, you've got to win it. So you get terribly optimistic. If you're military and you're going to get one of these vehicles, not another one for the next 20 years, you want it to fly and sing songs. So it's very demanding. I mean, the whole acquisition system is set up to get people to be terribly optimistic. And I mean, there are lazy people and there are people but that's true in the Financial Times. But generally, it's not nearly as bad. But when you start to think why now, the case that you talk, Ajax. Ajax is a tracked vehicle with a big gun on top. Yeah, and it has lots of electronics in it, and it has lots of communications in it, and it's a demanding system to make. The last time, well, first of all, they gave the contract to a company that had never done an armored vehicle in the UK for political reasons. Yeah, they wanted to diversify the supply chain so there would be more competition. And it was just, they did it in a context where the procurement body in the Ministry of Defence had not bought an armoured tracked vehicle since 1992. Now, what kind of expertise do you think? How many businesses in the civil world can survive not having a new project to do for 20 years? Yeah, that it was 1992, and then the next contract was 2014. Yeah, for an armoured vehicle. So when you start to look at particular things, you've got to look at the particular cases. And last point, I've been around a few countries, yeah, and when I said, if you say, go around countries and say, would you like to have a company like BAE Systems in your country? They don't say no. Yeah, they would like to have a company like BAE Systems and Rolls-Royce. Yeah. Oh, one last point. We have the most European defense industry in Europe. Yeah. We have Leonardo, we have Thales, we have Airbus in big time. So we have the most European, we have Rheinmetall now here. So we're not, it's a complicated world. Sorry.
I mean, I think that just highlights how this is difficult. And in the civil engineering world, of course, HS2 hasn't been a public procurement triumph either. So when you do other big projects, it's far from only in the defence sector. There's a question at the front here.
Mike Dix, NISA. One of the costs that you've touched on is public finances, but an even deeper one potentially is if we're going to give up using free markets and so on, if we're going to divert a lot of resources, to defence away from other things. And isn't the OBR going to end up sort of costing this in terms of what it feels is going to happen for potential growth? And is there going to be a significant hit there? And then even if it's a small hit, isn't that potentially going to lead to, if you like, more political instability if you're not delivering decent growth in the medium term? And that makes it even tougher to have the long-term focus that you think is the fundamental thing we really need.
I suppose it's even more than what the OBR scores it, is whether it does actually make the
reality is even more important.
Efficient. Jens.
I think my instincts are, I think like many economists, that sort of intervention and the economy you're describing is not a terribly good thing, and that government sticking their snout in the capital allocation is not something the corporate sector generally welcomes, because it tends to lead to less efficiency, and actually you do end up with waste. So that's the economist prior. I think the counter to that is our long track record of underinvestment, which even without any theoretical framework, looking back at it, it looks as if we have massively underinvested, including in defense and defense capabilities, but certainly in R&D, in any measure of tangible or intangible capital, we have underinvested. So it looks as if that, I mean, I can put my traditional economist hat on and identify a market failure. Something has gone wrong in terms of our investment record, and it seems plausible that the OBR scoring of additional investment is always conservative. But if you look at a sufficiently long horizon and an economy with a much higher investment to GDP ratio, particularly one that has a higher R&D to GDP ratio, I think is likely to be a more productive economy. That may not be scored, but equally the inefficiencies that come from the government, from a government that inefficiently interferes with the allocation of capital, that might not be scored either. So I'm not too worried about that, but I do think delivering that sustained increase, that sustained reallocation of resources can bring benefits. It's not going to be benefits in the short term. So there is a discussion about how do we achieve that. But it seems obvious to me for almost all developed market, and certainly for the UK, that we have underinvested very significantly.
Jenny, do you see there's a trade-off between your phrase of using all of economics versus efficiency in a pretty standard sense.
Yeah, I mean, so I agree with Jens. To some extent, this is a version of just doing some public investment, and it's in the defence space compared to other public investments. But as an economy that's had an under amount of investment in it for a significant period of time, in and of itself, that doesn't feel like it's necessarily a negative. It does depend what it's invested in and how that feeds through. But I do think you can make the case that there's a sort of problem in underinvestment. Secondly, I think this gets to back to my question of, are we really understanding the risks and the benefits properly? So it's difficult for the OBR given its mandate and the way traditional economics thinks about this. But if you think about the kind of world we're describing, you're imagining futures where you get a lot more tariff policy, you get a lot more state intervention in other markets, you get a lot more oil and energy price shocks, and you get a lot more security risks. And those are all should be baked into the thing we're trying to manage. So the future economic forecast should be taking account of the fact that there's some pretty big downsides out there. But they're not really, are they? We know that they don't. They're seen as outside tail risks, events that happen. And then the policies that you take to mitigate those risks are seen as a cost. But if that's the actual world that you're going to live in, these are good strategic investments to make your nation resilient. And when that might be the security thing, which we've talked about a lot today, the sort of narrower defence side. But as I've been saying, other investments in resilience, in the redundancies, they are, when weighed against the kind of cost we might actually see, good strategic trade-offs. But our models struggle to capture that because they are not built well to sort of build in those kind of risks. So I think there is something, which is what I mean by all of economics. It's kind of, we need to understand we're not in a perfect markets world, certainly not globally. And there's going to be more things that are going to disrupt that kind of efficiency model that we all know and love. So yes, they're going to take resources, and yes, there are some choices and trade-offs in it, but I think you have to widen the lens a bit about what's the problem you're trying to fix, and it's to manage some of that disruption and cost that's not well measured in the model. I think that's
yeah. So in pure public finance terms, that just means that the baseline the OBR might or might not be using might be wrong. So it is worse, but it might be the best thing we can do. I mean, other questions? I'm sure we got another 5 minutes. I'm sure there'll be someone who has a question or comment. Yeah, towards the back.
In International Women's Week, we haven't had a woman ask a question yet. So if one of the ladies in the room would like to ask the question, we'd be very keen to hear it.
This will either be the last question,
okay,
or there'll be a question from a woman.
As a relative outsider, I came here tonight to find out whether there was a crisis. And I've heard patches of talk of crisis and patches of, well, there are things we can do about it. But what surprises me, given the politics of all this, is that I don't hear the sense of crisis from government or the language of crisis. What I hear is that here we have a problem, but it can be solved within the boundaries of our policy, of our manifesto. It can be resolved while we maintain equity in the economy, and it can be resolved without breaching our manifesto commitments. Do you expect that to change in the next year? And are you as surprised as I am about that?
Thank you. That's a good question. Is there a question from a woman in the audience? Come on, can't be that shy. No, okay, so that is the last question. Is it a crisis, and are we going to be moving towards the language of crisis, let's say, for the next Parliament? Trevor.
There's a crisis that you mentioned at the beginning, which is how do we? There is a major problem. Crisis, you have to have a short time period available to deal with it, and to a certain extent, there's a bit more time available than you would have in other types of crisis. But there is a major challenge, which is coming to terms with what happens and how we deal with a very different United States whose future we do not understand and cannot predict. The problem with that is the government finds it so difficult to talk about this in public that they keep it off the agenda. All the things that were done are not mentioned in the Strategic Defence Review, and the people who were doing the review were told to keep away from the topic, which is unbelievable. And when they were told to do a root and branch review and avoided that issue. So I don't think there is that crisis. I think as far as Russia is concerned, while Ukraine continues to fight and we can continue to supply them with the means that they need for that, it's a judgment. It may be wrong, but one call is that the Russians have lost at least 250,000 dead in that war to capture 20% of Ukrainian territory. Now, translate 250,000 Russians, the Russian population about 130 million, translate that into British numbers and think what the UK would reaction to the tens of thousands of losses that we would have. I don't think the Russian armed forces are not going to be keen to rush off on another quick adventure. What they're like in 5 years, they're going to be quite keen to get in a better place. So I think, lots of people think it's at least 5 years before Russia would be in a position to take more risks. But that's probably on the edge of optimism.
Okay, Jenny.
I'm not a huge fan of the word crisis, because I think people use it a lot for kind of describing lots of different things. And I think, like fellow panelists, for me, it has a slight connotation of sort of a short-term thing that you need to sort of deal with that's just immediately in front of you. I think what we've been talking about on this panel is a much bigger sort of fundamental shift in the nature of the world, global relationships. And those kinds of things often take decades, actually. They are long run strategic realignments. And I think that's probably what we're in, rather than an immediate crisis in the sense that COVID felt like a crisis. And I think that's a more helpful way to think about it. I think in those situations, it does take a while for folk to understand that context, process it, and figure out the way forward. And I think we're in that journey at the moment as a country. So I'm not completely surprised that even our politicians don't have the fully formed answer. I say in my own paper that on the economic side, this is really difficult because we liked the old system. It worked really well for us. We helped design it and deliver it. And so this is hard yards thinking to actually recognize a difficult reality. And we've talked a lot about cost and challenge. And so I have some sympathy for the fact that this is difficult to do. But I do think the debate is taking us in the right direction. I do think, as we've mentioned, some of the events this year in terms of the sort of tariff policy, but also the positions on security are really crystallizing thinking. But I think this is going to be a years-long effort for the UK and other countries to figure out the right direction. And I think we actually have, enough of the time to do that.
Yeah. If we have a crisis in the next year, I think it'll flow from the Middle East, and it'll be an energy crisis, and the response will be focused on mitigating the consequences of sustained energy shock. I think so. Given that Jenny doesn't like crisis, reformulate your point in: is there urgency? And I am struck by the absence of urgency here and in some other governments. There are, as we discussed, governments in Europe that are responding with far greater urgency to the challenges that I think Russia is posing, and I would have. That's my personal opinion. I would have thought that really ought to be stepped up, and I'm surprised, given the challenges we've seen, given the nature of the conflict in between Russia and Ukraine, but also the continued Russian incursion, hybrid warfare, that we have done as little as we have.
Thank you very much. So I'm going to just very quickly summarize this past hour and a half. I think rather than the cost of security, we need to be focusing, I think the panel said, on the cost of insecurity. We're in a new world. It might not be a rupture, but it definitely needs new thinking, and maybe thinking in ways that we found difficult because we enjoyed the old world rather more, where we could focus on efficiency and global links more than we can today. We need to find the best way forward in this new world, which is going to be worse than the last world we were in. But that is the difficult reality that we face, and there's not necessarily enough urgency in responding to it. I think I'd like to thank the panel, thank Trevor, Jenny, Jens very much for a really stimulating hour and a half, and hope you enjoyed it as much as I did. Can we say thanks to the panel?